Alice was 13 when her mother died, and something in the house officially changed tense from present to past, from living to memory. How is Alice get here? What changed that make Alice wandering in the forest? Stay tuned and heard what happened in details. Before we continue, please subscribe, hit the like button, and comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your area right now. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our stories. Let me take you back to where it all started. The first thing Alice ever lost was her mother's laugh. She was 7 years old when she noticed it disappearing, not all at once, but the way morning light retreats from a room when clouds gather outside. One day Favor was singing in the kitchen, her voice winding through the small corridors of their home like something alive, and the next day she was not. She was sitting at the table instead, hands folded, eyes distant, listening to the sound of Gabriel's second wife rearranging the furniture in the parlor as though the house had always belonged to her. Alice stood in the doorway between both sounds, her mother's silence and Mercy's noise, and understood without the words to say it that something had broken. But the story does not begin with the breaking. It begins, as most true stories do, much earlier, in the quiet years before sorrow learned the family's address. Gabriel Afalian was not a complicated man when he was young. He was steady and careful, the kind of man who took his time with things, with his words, with his choices, with love. He met Favor at a church harvest celebration, where she was helping arrange flowers along the altar rail with the focused attention of someone who believed that small things mattered. He watched her for 20 minutes before he spoke to her, and when he finally did, she looked up at him without surprise, as though she had known he was coming. They built their life together the way people build when they believe the structure is meant to last, slowly, deliberately, with attention to the foundation. Their home was small but orderly. Gabriel worked in timber, traveling occasionally to the city but always returning by Friday evening. Favor taught the young children in their village the basics of reading and arithmetic, not as a formal teacher, but as a woman who believed that knowledge was something to be passed like bread freely to whoever was hungry. When Alice was born, Gabriel wept. He was not a man who cried easily, but the sight of his daughter, calm even as a newborn, her eyes taking in the world with an expression of mild curiosity, undid him completely. Favor laughed at his tears, and he laughed too, and for a long time after, the memory of that shared laughter was the warmth at the center of the home. Alice grew into herself quietly. She was not the loudest child or the most demanding. She observed. She listened. She helped her mother in the kitchen not because she was told to, but because she liked the closeness of it, the way their hands could be busy with the same task, the way conversation flowed easier when the eyes had something else to do. She was her mother's shadow and her father's quiet pride, and for the first 10 years of her life it was enough. Then the pressure began. It did not come from inside the house at first. It came from outside, from uncles who visited and stayed too long, from neighbors whose questions carried edges, from the collective anxiety of a community that measured a man's worth in the number of children who carried his name. Gabriel had one daughter. One was not enough, they said, in the way people say things they believe to be obvious facts rather than cruel opinions. What of the land? What of the name? What if something happened? Who would remain? Favor heard these questions and folded them away. She was a woman of deep and unperformed faith, the kind that does not need to announce itself, that simply holds its shape under pressure. She told Gabriel that their daughter was not a consolation, she was a gift. She told him that children came in divine timing, not social schedules. She told him these things with a gentleness that was genuine, not practiced. But Gabriel's fear was not a thing that responded to gentleness. It was a thing that responded to numbers, to years counted, to brothers with multiple sons, to the slow accumulation of doubt that a man gathers when he suspects he may have disappointed the world. By the time Alice was 10, the fear had grown into something with weight and shape, something that sat between Gabriel and Favor at the dinner table and made the meals quieter than they used to be. He tried to resist it. He did not decide quickly or without anguish. But in the end, fear proved more patient than love, and Gabriel Afalian took a second wife. Her name was Mercy, which would later strike Alice as one of the great ironies of her life. Mercy arrived at the compound on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day until it was. She came with boxes and purposefulness, and the way she surveyed the house suggested she was not arriving so much as returning to something she already owned. She was not unkind to Favor at first. She was something more dangerous than unkind. She was strategic. She greeted her with the appropriate deference, kept her distance in the early weeks, and observed the rhythms of the household with the sharp, patient attention of someone learning a system she intended to master. Favor watched all of this and said very little. She was not naive. She understood exactly what was happening. But she was also a woman who had decided long ago that her peace was not something she would surrender easily, and so she held it carefully like a flame in wind. Alice was 11 when Mercy arrived, old enough to feel the shift but too young to fully name it. She noticed that her father laughed differently around Mercy, louder, with a kind of performance in it. She noticed that her mother began eating after everyone else, as if she had quietly renegotiated her own place at the table. She noticed that the house, which had once felt like it exhaled, now felt like it was holding its breath. When Mercy became pregnant, Gabriel glowed. His family celebrated. His neighbors nodded with the satisfaction of people who believe they have been proven right. Amaka was born first, round-cheeked and loud. And then 2 years later, Ben, who was immediately treated as something sacred. Mercy, already confident, became a different order of powerful. She had given Gabriel what Favor had not been able to, or so the story was told, and the telling of it determined everything. She stopped being strategic and became direct. She corrected Favor in front of visitors. She redirected Gabriel's decisions with a kind of casual authority that suggested she had always been in charge and was simply tired of pretending otherwise. She spoke about the household finances, the food, the visitors, the children's schedules, and Gabriel, caught between his guilt and his relief, found it easier to follow than to resist. Favor endured. She prayed. She was kind to Amaka and Ben even as they looked through her. She was kind to Alice in the particular way of a woman who knows that what she gives her daughter now must be enough to last long after she is gone. Then she became pregnant. The news did not travel quietly. Favor herself said little, she told Gabriel, and Gabriel, to his credit, seemed genuinely moved, some old warmth returning briefly to his eyes. But Mercy received the news as a verdict. A pregnancy meant shift, meant possibility, meant that the story everyone had accepted, Favor as decline, Mercy as ascent, might need to be reconsidered. It was a possibility Mercy was not willing to allow. She left the village 3 weeks later, telling Gabriel she was visiting a distant relative. She returned after 10 days with nothing she would name and something she would not put down. The change in her was subtle enough that perhaps only Favor and Alice noticed. There was a new stillness in her movements, a coldness where there had been heat. She was quieter, more deliberate. She began, in small ways, to control what Favor ate, bringing dishes, insisting, framing each gesture as care. Favor's health declined by degrees. The pregnancy, which should have brought strength, seemed instead to drain it. She grew thin in a way that worried Alice deeply, though Alice did not have the language or the power to do anything but watch. She brought her mother water. She sat with her in the evenings. She held her mother's hand and felt, without understanding it, that she was trying to hold something that was already leaving. Favor died before the baby could come. The household mourned in the formal, public way that households mourn. There were people and food and the correct expressions of grief. Gabriel wept genuinely, Alice believed. But grief without accountability is a season, and seasons pass, and when the mourners left and the compound grew quiet again, Mercy remained, and her remaining was its own kind of answer. Alice was 13 when her mother died, and something in the house officially changed tense. from present to past, from living to memory. She was given chores that grew with each passing month as though mercy was calibrating precisely how much a girl could carry. The kitchen before dawn, the water from the compound tap, the washing, the sweeping, the scrubbing of floors on hands and knees. While Amaka and Ben slept or quarreled or demanded things that Alice was expected to provide, school became something that happened to other children. Alice watched them pass the compound gate in their uniforms and felt the absence of it like a missing tooth, constantly, involuntarily. Mercy did not beat her often. She had subtler instruments. She had words deployed at exactly the right moment to ensure maximum damage. She had the ability to assign blame with the confidence of a judge: the burnt soup, the missing item, the neighbor's complaint, all of it somehow Alice's fault, Alice's carelessness, Alice's deficiency. Amaka absorbed her mother's language and repeated it with the enthusiasm of a child who has found a reliable way to feel superior. Ben was younger and crueler without effort, the way some children are cruel, reflexively, and without consequence. Alice survived these years in the way that certain plants survive drought, by sending roots deeper, finding water in places others do not think to look. She held her mother's memory like a private scripture. She remembered the sound of Favor's voice, the particular way she tilted her head when she was listening, the feeling of her hand, warm and certain, on Alice's forehead at night. These were things Mercy could not reach, and Alice kept them where they were safest place inside the house. She also had the ring. She did not speak of it. She had received it years ago, before all of this, from an old woman she had encountered near the edge of the forest as a small child, a woman whose presence she had never fully been able to explain, whose face she remembered more clearly than faces she saw every day. The woman had pressed a ring into her small palm and spoken quietly, with the tone of someone delivering information rather than making a wish. Alice had kept it hidden since then, wrapped in a small cloth tucked into a crack in the wall behind her sleeping mat. She did not fully understand it. She did not need to. Some things are carried by faith rather than comprehension. She was 19 when Mercy had her removed from the house. The stated reason was an argument, but Alice understood that arguments had never been the real reason for anything in that household. The real reason was simpler and older than language. Alice had grown beautiful and graceful in the specific way that goodness sometimes makes people beautiful, and Mercy, who had spent years reducing her, found that she could not. Alice's eyes were still clear. Her posture was still straight. She moved through suffering without being bent by it. And this, more than anything, was what Mercy could not tolerate. She was sent away in the early evening, without preparation and without ceremony, directed toward the forest outside the village and told not to return. Gabriel said nothing. He was somewhere else by then, not physically, but in the way that men who have lived with their choices long enough eventually go somewhere else in their minds. Alice walked until the village sounds faded and the forest sounds replaced them. The trees here were old and close together, and the light failed quickly once she was beneath them. Fear moved through her in waves, and she let it, because she had learned that fear was something to be felt rather than refused. It was the refusing that made you stumble. She walked for what felt like a long time, and then the old woman was there. She stood between two trees as though she had been waiting, which perhaps she had. She was exactly as Alice remembered, the same economy of expression, the same eyes that held steadiness without effort. She looked at Alice the way people look at a journey that has gone exactly as expected. She told Alice not to be afraid. She told her to find the hidden path, the one that ran along the dried stream bed, and to follow it without stopping until she reached its end. She told her she had until nightfall, and that what moved in this forest after dark was not something she needed to know more about. She said one more thing about the ring, that the time for it was coming, and then she was simply not there in the way that certain presences simply are not there when you look again. Alice found the path. She followed it. She did not stop. She emerged from the forest at the edge of a road she did not recognize, and the road led, as roads do, somewhere else entirely. The city received her the way cities receive everyone, without particular interest, without cruelty, without welcome. It was simply there, enormous and ongoing, indifferent to the fact that she had arrived with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a ring hidden in the hem of her dress. She was hungry within the first day. She slept in a doorway the first night, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the city's nighttime sounds and cataloging them the way she had learned to catalog things, as information, not threat. The restaurant was small and smelled of frying oil and pepper soup, and the woman who ran it, a wide woman named Mama Chisholm, who communicated primarily through the direction of her eyes, did not ask many questions when Alice offered to work for food. She handed her an apron and pointed at the kitchen, and Alice, who had spent 6 years of her life in various stages of domestic labor, found that she knew what to do. She washed dishes. She swept. She learned which tables needed their orders repeated and which customers preferred not to be spoken to. She slept in the storeroom on a mat behind the stacked crates, and she was grateful for it, genuinely, specifically grateful, in the way that people are grateful for things they have earned rather than received. The city revealed itself to her in pieces. She learned the bus routes by riding them, the prices of things by asking, the unspoken codes of sidewalks and markets by watching. She remained quiet and kept to herself, and people let her, which was its own kind of freedom after years of being seen and judged and found wanting. The ring stayed hidden. It was not time. She met him because he dropped something. He was moving quickly through the market, a tall man in a business shirt, carrying too many things, with the slightly abstracted expression of someone whose mind is partially elsewhere. And he dropped a small notebook, and Alice, who happened to be passing, picked it up and held it out to him. He stopped and looked at her, and then he kept looking, in the particular way of someone who is trying to locate a memory. His name was Daniel Raphael. She learned this later. What she understood first, in that moment of eye contact in the middle of a busy market, was that something was happening that she did not have a full name for, a recognition that worked below the surface of ordinary introduction, like two instruments suddenly tuning to the same note. He thanked her, she nodded, she walked away. But the city is not as large as it presents itself, and their paths crossed again at the restaurant where she worked, where he came with a colleague for lunch, and sat at the corner table, and looked up when she brought the water and went still in the same way as before. He did not rush. She appreciated that. He asked if he could speak with her when her shift ended, and she agreed, because there was something in the quality of his attention, careful, not grasping, that she trusted without fully knowing why. He told her about the dreams over tea, in the straightforward manner of someone who has decided that pretending is too expensive. He had been dreaming, for months, of a woman's hands extending a ring toward him. Not her face, her hands. And something about the stillness of Alice's hands as she set down his cup had moved through him like a current. Alice was quiet for a long time after he spoke. Then she reached into the hidden hem of her dress and placed the ring on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. And then something in his face changed, not dramatically, but the way weather changes before rain, a settling, a release of pressure. He told her about his wife then, how she had died bringing their son into the world, leaving him with a grief so layered he had stopped trying to find its bottom. He had continued his work, his son, the routines that held a life in place, but something had been waiting in him, unresolved, and he had not known until this moment what it had been waiting for. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about loss and survival, and the strange persistence of hope in people who should perhaps have abandoned it. Alice told him about her mother, about the years in her father's house, about the forest and the old woman. He listened with the full attention of a man who understands that some stories are being told for the first and only time. Their love did not arrive with fanfare. It came the way her mother's faith had always described good things, coming quietly, in its own time, without apology for the waiting. They saw each other again and again, and each time the space between them grew smaller by choice rather than momentum. He introduced her to his son, a serious 4-year-old named Joshua who studied Alice with the focused suspicion of a child conducting an honest assessment, and then decided after several visits that she was acceptable. They were married in a ceremony that was small and genuine, which is the only kind of ceremony that matters. They returned to the village 7 years later, on a dry season morning when the harmattan was beginning to pull at the leaves. The compound was smaller than Alice remembered, or perhaps she was simply larger. The walls needed work. The garden her mother had once kept had returned to bare earth. Gabriel sat in a chair outside his door, older than years alone could account for, the particular tiredness of a man who has outlived his certainties. He looked up when Alice approached, and she watched something move across his face. Shame and relief in the same motion, two things that often travel together. She sat with him for a long time. She did not say everything because not everything needed to be said. Some of it simply needed to be sat with, and she was willing to do that. Mercy came out of the house eventually, leaning on the doorframe. She was ill, Alice could see that clearly, diminished in the way of people whose power was always borrowed from circumstance rather than built from within. Amaka lived in another city and rarely visited. Ben had complicated debts and a distant manner. The household that had once been managed with aggressive precision was now simply quiet. Mercy looked at Alice for a long moment. Then she said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without decoration or explanation, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever offered. Alice nodded. She did not perform forgiveness. She had done the interior work of it long before this moment, in the way that people who genuinely heal do the work privately and arrive at the visible moment already finished. She forgave her not because what was done was small, but because carrying it any further would have required her to put down things she valued more. She and Daniel left in the afternoon, Joshua asleep in the back of the car, the village growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Alice watched it diminish without grief and without contempt, simply as a place she had come from, one part of a longer journey that had brought her, by roads she would not have chosen and could not have predicted, to exactly where she was. She reached over and rested her hand over Daniel's on the gear shift. Outside, the road stretched forward, long and unhurried into the rest of their lives. Did you enjoy this story? What lesson did you learn from Alice's journey? Please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and comment below what you learned from this story. Turn on your notification bell so you never miss amazing stories like this. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.